You are listening to The Memory Keeper by Evan Vaile. Chapter 24.
Reece blinked his eyes open. The first thing he noticed was the wonderfully comfortable bed he was lying on. A blanket had been thrown over him, and the pillow beneath his head was soft, impossibly soft. It had been so long since he'd slept on anything but wood or cold concrete. Pain lanced through his shoulder as he sat up, but he knew immediately that the wound had been re-stitched and bandaged. The only source of light in the large room was the tiny window high above, near the cornice. He estimated it to be 1 foot high and 3 wide. The floor was carpeted, and the walls were unpainted brick. The ceiling looked like the underside of someone's floor and comprised many rows of horizontal timber beams. Novels and encyclopedias lined the bookcase. On the floor was a stack of newspapers 2 feet high. The shelves of the wardrobe at the foot of the bed were empty, save for the thin layer of dust. Reece had spent enough time underground to know exactly what underground felt like, and he correctly guessed the room to be a basement. Where that basement was, he had no idea. Sunlight streamed in through the small window in dusty bands which cut across the room and illuminated the wooden stairwell on the far side. He saw that the room had a few conveniences: toilet, basin, and mirror, desk and chair. But there was no clock on the wall, and Reece wondered how long he had been unconscious. He sat upright on the bed and held his aching head. Whatever the old bastard had given him to knock him out for the journey had left him with a hangover that made the room swim around his eyes. But the handcuffs were gone now, and for that he was thankful. He shakily made his way over to the steps and up to the heavy door. It was firmly locked when he tried it, and after a few moments of twisting and thumping, he gave up and walked back down the stairs. The room was comfortable, but in his experience, a prison cell was still a cell, no matter what the conveniences. The mirror was a novelty, and he spent some time in front of it examining his appearance. He tried to remember the last time he had seen his own reflection. It must have been at least a few years ago. He was taller now, and he noticed his jaw had squared off and his chest had filled out. His shoulder wound had been nicely stitched up, and he'd seen enough sutures to know a good job when he saw one. Whoever this old man was, he knew how to use a needle and thread. There was a sound from the door. Reece turned around and saw John Q step into the room and start down the stairs. At first, Reece couldn't work out what was different, and then he realized the old man wasn't wearing the sunglasses. His eyes were clear and grey and looked straight at Reece the same way Reece looked straight back at them. He was wearing the same clothes, minus the jacket. The holstered tranquilizer gun was still strapped to the wily old coot's side and gave him a distinct advantage. "I'm glad to see you're awake," John Q said, stopping at the foot of the stairs and casually leaning against the banister with his arms crossed. A moment of silence passed between the pair as each sized up the other. Reece realized that John Q was taller than he had first thought. There wasn't much youth left in his face, but senility looked a long way off. His complacent smile suggested he was a man who had been playing the game for a long time and winning. Reece rubbed his hand over the stubble of hair on his head and glanced around. "What time is it?" he asked. John Q checked his wristwatch. "Just after 4 in the afternoon." Reece knew the police had grabbed him at about 9 in the morning. "Why was I out for so long? I thought you said the tranquilizers lasted for 1 hour. The old man shrugged. "I shot you a few more times in the car when you started to wake up. I couldn't have you remembering every freaking street we went down. And I must confess, it was a much nicer drive with you sleeping the whole way and not asking me annoying questions." Reece scowled and started across the room toward the toilet. Not 2 steps had he taken before John Q drew his tranquilizer gun in one smooth motion and leveled it at the young man. Reece stopped, watching the old man's grey eyes. "You see how it works?" John Q said. "You come too close to me, and I point the gun at you." Reece shook his head and walked over to the toilet, sensing the gun move with him the whole way. "Well, I'm going to take a piss," he said over his shoulder. "So would you like to point your gun at that?" "This time I'll make an exception," John Q grunted, putting the weapon away. "How's your shoulder?" Reece went about the business of emptying his bladder and replied, "Which one?" John Q threw Reece a discontented glance which the young man didn't see, and then started up the stairs with a sigh. "Okay, have it your way," he said, his raspy voice echoing down the stairwell. "You don't have to talk to me if you don't want to. I'll be in the house." When you get hungry, knock on the door a few times, and I might consider bringing you some food. There's water in the taps." The old prick slammed the door shut, and Reece heard the sound of the deadlock mechanism sliding into place. He quickly zipped his shorts up and yelled up the stairs. "How long are you going to keep me down here?" "As long as it takes," came the faint reply from above. "As long as it takes for what?" Reece yelled back, but there was no answer. By the time the sun had set, Reece had investigated all possible avenues of escape from his comfortable prison cell. The sole window wasn't barred as he had expected, but when he looked at the geometry of the situation, he realized he would never be able to squeeze through such a small space. The door was firmly locked, and no amount of beating would break it down. The walls were solid brick, and the floor was solid concrete beneath the carpet, which he uprooted to examine. And there was no secret door hidden behind the bookshelf. He climbed up on the bed again and peered through the small window. It was at ground level, and he had a great view of the grass and a small shed with firewood stacked in front. Not a lot of help in determining where he was, but if he had been unconscious for several hours and travelling the whole time, then John Q had taken him quite some way from Melbourne. When the last of the sun rays faded away, he switched on the desk lamp and contemplated everything he knew about John Q from the dead nurse's sole memory. It was the rumours the nurse had heard about the old man that were the most useful to Reece. Rumours that suggested John Q was the doctor who had studied the Deacon many years before the program even existed. But the nurse's sole memory also revealed that John Q despised the director and regretted the program. Two things which rang true with Reece. Reece heard the door open again and sat up quickly. His hangover had passed and his mind felt clear and sharp. "What do you want?" he yelled. "I don't think I can handle any more of your sparkling conversation." "I'm just dropping some food off," John Q called. "I don't remember knocking on the door," Reece yelled. "Well, I thought you might be hungry anyway," the old man replied. "I don't want you to starve to death." "I don't want your stinking food," Reece retorted. Reece heard the thud of something heavy being placed on the top timber step. "Uh-huh," John Q said. "When was the last time you had a steak dinner?" The door slammed shut and the deadlock slid into place. Reece sat on the bed with his legs swinging over the edge, cursing his lack of bargaining power with this crazy old man. The delicious aroma of steak and vegetables got his attention. When he could stay away no longer, he raced up the stairs, where he found a dinner place loaded with steaming hot food and a can of soft drink. He scooped them up and then paused at the door. "Hey," he yelled, "how about a knife and fork?" "Forget it," came the reply from somewhere in the house. "I don't trust you with sharp implements yet." Reece took a step down and then thought of something else. He was still wearing the shorts and wind cheater he stole from the pool. "What about some decent clothes?" "What for?" John Q yelled back. "You're not going anywhere?" Reece marched back down the stairwell, grumbling about how they shouldn't leave the gate open at the nursing home. He dumped the dinner plate on the desk and dug in, using his hands to scoop the food into his mouth. Steak, potatoes, carrots, and peas, all smothered in an absolutely delicious sauce. The old geezer might be a crackpot, but he knew how to cook. Reece opened the can of soft drink and guzzled a long draught. "Asshole," he belched, then tucked into a baked potato. Reece fell asleep soon after he'd finished the meal and didn't wake till dawn the following morning. Apparently, John Q rose with the sun as well, because Reece heard him walking around in the house above. Pretty soon, the basement door squeaked open and the old man stood on the top step. "Feel like talking?" John Q asked. Reece was sitting on the edge of the bed again. "What do you want to talk about?" John Q shrugged. "It's up to you." Reece picked at a piece of food stuck between his teeth. "Are you going to shoot me again?" "That depends on if you are going to pull any crazy stunts," John Q replied. Reece inclined his head slightly. "You mean, like trying to escape?" "Yes," John Q replied. "Are you going to let me out?" Reece asked. "I wasn't planning on it," John Q admitted. "Then I might try to escape," Reece said flatly. "Well then, I might have to shoot you again," John Q retorted. "In that case, piss off," Reece said. John Q chuckled and turned to leave. "Suit yourself," he said, then slammed the door. Other than when the old man delivered meals, Reece didn't see or hear from him for the next 4 days. And if John Q had some kind of spy hole looking into the basement, then he was definitely using it, because most of the time he turned up when Reece was asleep. The young man would awaken to discover the crumbs of his last meal removed and replaced by the next dish. His request for a menu one evening was greeted with genuine amusement from the old bastard. Usually, John Q just left the meal on the top step and slammed the door shut without saying a word. Still, Reece couldn't complain about the quality of the food, but the lack of communication from his host, as John Q liked to refer to himself with a chuckle, began to annoy him. But boredom is boredom wherever you are, and hostage situations are no exception. With no other means to fill his time, Reece turned his attention to the books neatly lined up on the bookcase. Some of the novels looked interesting, but he hadn't the enthusiasm for fiction. The encyclopedias held his concentration for a day, but after that, he started leafing through the newspapers. The ones on the bottom of the pile were the oldest, and he read those first, front page to back. The years spent away from the world had robbed him of his general knowledge, and all he knew about the previous 2 years was the facts contained in other people's soul memories. His mind devoured all the information the newspapers had to offer. Hours melted into days, and he would often be awake late at night perusing the newspapers by the solitary light of the desk lamp. On the 6th morning of Reece's confinement, John Q opened the door and thumped down the stairs wearing hiking gear and a broad-brimmed hat. He stopped on the bottom step and puffed contentedly on a cigar. "So, how are we this morning?" John Q asked. Reece rubbed the sleep from his eyes. "Oh, so you've decided to talk to me now? If I remember correctly, you were the one who told me to piss off." He walked over to the bookshelf and waved his cigar in the direction of the novels. "Did you read any of these?" Reece shook his head. John Q affected a look of surprise. "Why not? You don't like Dickens?" "I can't get into them," Reece said. John Q tapped his foot against the pile of newspapers on the floor. "What about these?" he asked. Reece glanced at the papers and nodded. "I read those. Nothing about the program in them." "There wouldn't be," John Q replied. "It was one of the government's nasty little secrets. Very few people knew it existed, and most of them worked at the facility itself, which means most of them are dead now." He puffed thoughtfully on his cigar. "Tell me, did you miss reading when you were underground?" "Not really," Reece said. "Come on, a smart kid like you," John Q pressed. Reece yawned. "What makes you think I'm smart?" John Q tipped the brim of his hat back. "We doctors have ways of knowing these things." Reece looked over at the old man, thinking of the stitches in his own shoulder, not the work of a St. John's first aid graduate. "So you are a doctor," he said. John Q shrugged. "Sometimes." "What do you want from me?" Reece asked, not for the first time. "I just want to talk," John Q replied. Reece made a dramatic gesture and said, "Well, we're talking, aren't we?" At that, John Q merely nodded enigmatically, then turned and started walking back up the stairs. Reece sat up on the bed and waited for the old man to say something else, but all he heard was the rhythmic thump of footsteps ascending the steps. "Wait a minute," Reece called. "Where are you going?" "It's a beautiful day," John Q said over his shoulder. "So I thought I'd take a walk outside." Reece swore under his breath. What was this asshole's problem? "But we're talking now, right?" he said. "Like you want." The footsteps never slowed. "Yes, we are." "When can I go out?" Reece called angrily. "Later," John Q called back. Reece shook his head in exasperation. "What am I supposed to do now?" he yelled in frustration. "Keep reading and keep healing," came the reply. "I want to see that shoulder mended as soon as possible. How is it feeling, by the way?" Reece recalled giving the old man a smart aleck response last time he'd been asked that question. This time, he opted for politeness. "Getting better," he said. "Good," John Q grunted. "I could use some more newspapers," Reece yelled. The sound of the footsteps ended at the top step, and then the door banged shut. It was only after John Q had gone that Reece realised the old man hadn't been armed with the gun. Later that evening, John Q made an appearance looking a little rosy in the face with sunburn and carrying a large cardboard box in both hands. Reece glanced up from the newspaper he was reading, but didn't deign to pay the old coot too much attention. John Q dumped the box on the floor, and Reece saw that it was filled to the top with crisp newspapers. "Here you go," John Q said, breathing heavily from the exertion. "So you finished all the other papers already?" Reece returned to the article he was reading but said, "In case you didn't notice, there's not a lot else to do down here. Where are you getting all these newspapers?" "Kid," John Q began, "I arranged for your acquisition from police custody. I thought you would have taken it for granted that I can arrange the acquisition of a few newspapers." Reece spun around in his seat. "Well, I wouldn't have come with you if I'd known you would force me to read your stupid newspapers all day long." John Q waved a disapproving finger at the young man. "I thought you'd finally dispensed with the bravado," he chided. "This attitude will be counterproductive if we are going to work together." Reece threw up his hands in frustration. "Work together on what, John?" But the old man was already halfway up the stairs and just chuckled at the question. Nylander fished through the new bundle of papers, noting the dates again. This time, the stack of papers covered most of last year. He extracted a broadsheet, then settled down at the desk to read. The squeak of the basement door opening and the thump of John Q's shoes on the timber stairs became familiar sounds to Reece. And after a while, he barely even glanced up whenever the mysterious old man came to pay him a visit. The newspapers kept on coming, and Reece kept on reading. But then, 2 days later, John Q turned up with a gift. Another box, this time not filled with newspapers. "I think these should be about the right size," John Q said, leaving the box of clothes on the desk. The young man and the old man stood side by side. Reece opened up the top of the box and began examining the items, one at a time. "Well, it's an improvement on my shorts and wind cheater, I suppose." "As I recall, they aren't your shorts and wind cheater," the old man replied. "They were someone else's clothes that you stole." Reece checked a black woolen jumper against himself for size. "Whatever," he mumbled. John Q started for the exit. "You've got to break this habit of thinking you can just steal anything you want. The police will get you eventually, and we can't have that." "When you don't have any money," Reece said, placing the jumper on the bed and selecting another garment from the box. "You don't have any choice." "Don't worry," John Q muttered. "Money's not going to be a problem." But Reece was busy admiring his new wardrobe and didn't hear John Q's response. New clothes were a luxury he had forgotten even existed. He heard the old man walking up the steps. "It's about time you started treating me better," Reece called out. "I notice you're not carrying your gun anymore," Reece said, his eyes not leaving the newspaper in front of him. Yesterday, he had cleaned the dust out of the wardrobe and arranged his apparel inside. He was dressed in jeans, sneakers, and the black woolen jumper. John Q deposited the lasagna on the desk and regarded the young man carefully. "I can go and get it if you want," he offered. Reece looked up and smiled guilelessly. "That's okay. Does this mean I'll be getting cutlery with my meals soon?" John Q scratched the back of his head. "I hadn't thought about it," he lied. "How about just a spoon for my morning cereal? Slurping it out of the bowl is getting kind of annoying." "You're a dangerous young man, Reece," John Q answered, "and I wouldn't want you to be tempted to do something stupid." Reece feigned surprise. "Are you still worried about that?" He laughed. "After all, you gave me all these newspapers?" The old man frowned. "What are you going to do? Beat me up with a newspaper?" "I can think of half a dozen ways to kill someone with a newspaper," Reece said lightly, watching John Q for a reaction. John mused, but he didn't appear concerned. "I'm sorry I asked. Needless to say, no spoon for you." That night, as Reece rummaged through the box, he chanced across some newspapers dated 10 days ago, the day of the disaster in the city subway station. Why John Q hadn't included any papers which mentioned that event in the first bundle, Reece wasn't sure, but he sat down at the desk and somberly read every article, editorial, and letter about the incident. One thing became immediately clear. The authorities were yet to determine the cause of the train crash. Initially, the newspapers focused on the crash itself and the lives it had taken, but soon the discussion turned to the underground super prison, as it was called by journalists, which had been discovered beneath the subway. The final death toll numbered 362, mostly office workers aged between 20 and 50 years old. One article lamented the loss of 22 primary school children and 3 teachers who had been returning from an excursion to the City Museum on the fated train. In another article, engineers debated what could have caused the train to collapse through the floor of the subway platform and how train station design might be improved to prevent any such structural failure occurring in the future. Several early reports attempted to link the underground super prison with the subway disaster, but the articles lacked any hard evidence. It seemed that the alleged second explosion had incinerated all evidence of what had transpired in the super prison, with only charred bodies and empty concrete corridors remaining. Reece carefully perused the newspapers in chronological order, beginning with the day of the disaster. The wily old coot had even included the present day's paper, but Reece left that one till last. With every passing edition, more and more articles about the super prison appeared. The government was extensively quoted denying all knowledge of the facility and promising to unravel the mystery. Reece noticed another pattern as he flicked through the broadsheets. The number of murders in the inner city area doubled, tripled, then quadrupled in the days following the crash. The central business district was particularly strongly hit with a wave of terrible killings. Strippers and prostitutes were targeted, and one tabloid suggested Jack the Ripper stalked the streets again, albeit a century after his death and on the other side of the globe. In another more reputable paper, no less than 12 articles were devoted to discussing the plague of violent crime which had descended on Melbourne. The Archbishop was quoted as suggesting the devil had surfaced through the centre of the city, and the citizens of Melbourne should return to the wholesome values espoused by the Church, lest the whole city burn in hell. Melbourne now. Murder capital of world was typical of the headlines. Residents were terrified to leave their apartments, and people began to draw connections between the very mysterious and very empty super prison beneath their city. The letters to the editor became increasingly vitriolic, arguing that the government was covering up the escape of dozens of dangerous inmates. As one writer phrased it, if the facility is a prison, then where are all the prisoners? Some of the murders were too idiosyncratic for Reece to miss. Woman beheaded by thief for necklace was certainly the work of Guill O'tine, apparently in a supermarket car park late at night. The article added that the lady's head was still missing, and Reece suspected they'd probably never see it again. Man murdered, eyes removed, was without a doubt Shady Atkins's style, a strangely unsubtle crime for a young criminal of such intelligence and sensibility. The article didn't reveal if the killer had stolen any money from the victim, but suggested that the police were investigating possible links with organised crime. Reece shook his head, knowing the authorities were way off with that theory. The article entitled "Nurse Murdered with Syringe" was sadly typical of the inmate who called himself Long User, or Loser as he was known to the others, a gaunt young man who liked to inject toxic substances into his victims when he could find a vein. Man garroted with guitar wire was certainly a melody Woodstock would play, an inmate with a penchant for musical instruments. Reece knew that guitar strings and tuning forks were Woody's weapons of choice. Ironically, Reece remembered the lanky ex-program subject as having no ear for music. It seemed Woody made off with the guitar after killing its owner, and Reece knew he needed the practice. Man murdered. Then hung to dry was a grisly story, and Reece wasn't certain who was to blame. He suspected the hand of Caliper, but hearts were more that inmate's style, specifically beating hearts. Reece wondered if he was seeing a signature murder of the Deacon, but he knew nothing of the man, and so it was impossible to tell. There were a number of other murders that Reece recognised, and many that he did not. Some of the crimes were simply too general in their details for him to determine which of the program's inmates was the culprit. Any of the beatings could have been the work of Roan and Stiles, or none of them. One particular article in the newspaper dated 2 days after the train crash caught his eye, and he read it carefully. Priest murdered in own church. A well-known Melbourne priest was found brutally murdered in his own church this morning. Detective Greg O'Brien said the 53-year-old man was discovered at 7 a.m. by a colleague when parishioners raised the alarm. Police are baffled by the violence of the crime and are appealing to the community for any information. Father Clements was attacked and murdered in his Canterbury church sometime after the 7 p.m. Mass. The killer stabbed Father Clements in the eye with a rose stem and cut his tongue out with a letter opener. Detective O'Brien told reporters this morning. The cause of death was a broken neck. An undisclosed sum of money was stolen from the safe by the criminal. The church minister is described by his parishioners as a kind and gentle man who was devoted to his service of the Lord. Everybody liked him, said Father McLean, who worked with the late Father Clements for 10 years. He will be greatly missed by the church community. Continued, page 4. Reece read the remainder of the article, then leaned back in his chair thoughtfully. Though he couldn't explain why, there was a similarity between this crime and one of the other murders he had read about. He flicked back through the pages until he found the article entitled "Man Murdered, Then Hung to Dry," and reread the details. The eyeball on the rose and the human clothesline. There was something particularly twisted about the two murders, and Reece suspected the same hand was responsible. Whose it was he couldn't be sure, but by the soft light of the desk lamp, he found himself wondering about the Deacon again. Reece knew more than a few of the murders would be his. It was just a matter of which ones. With such thoughts on his mind, he switched off the lamp and went to bed. Reece was standing at the basin, brushing his teeth when he heard John Q open the door and start down the stairs. The old man was wearing his typical self-satisfied grin when Reece glanced over his shoulder at him. John Q walked over and sat on the edge of the desk, crossed his arms, and surveyed the disarray of newspapers around the room. "How's the shoulder feeling?" the old man asked. "Good," Reece replied. John Q nodded. "Read anything interesting lately?" Reece ignored the old coot's question. "I've been down here for 12 days, and you still haven't told me what you want from me." "Oh," John Q answered, "Yarm, you're still on about that." Deprivation of liberty tends to prey on a person's mind after a while, Reece said sarcastically. The old prick chuckled. "Don't worry, I'll tell you what I want from you. But first, I want you to tell me something." Reece spat out the toothpaste and rinsed his mouth with water. "Tell you what?" he asked. "Have you read last week's newspapers?" John Q asked. "Yes," Reece said. John Q picked up a paper from the desk and flicked through the pages until he found an article about a murder. The headline read, "Man Clubbed to Death," and featured a photograph of the street where the crime occurred. John Q held the paper up for the young man to see. "What can you tell me about this?" he asked. Reece glanced at the article and shrugged. "Someone got murdered," he said. "That's very perceptive of you," John Q replied without humour. "Do you think Sepulchre is responsible?" Reece was silent for a while, drying his hands on a towel. "No," he said finally. "The victim died from massive injuries sustained to the top of the skull. Investigators say that the weapon used to beat the man to death must have been larger than a baseball bat. Sounds more like the work of Kaba to me." John Q nodded and quickly scanned the details of the article again. By God, the boy was right. Kaba was the natural culprit. His thoughts drifted as Reece explained that Kaba was Scottish and had named himself after the national sport of caber tossing. John Q nodded absently. He had recently discovered through unofficial sources that virtually no information had been salvaged from the program's mainframe computer. He knew that Special Projects Division had physical descriptions no more precise than skinhead with which to track the escaped inmates. Reece Nylander knew more about the subjects of the program than anyone in the SPD. John Q looked at Reece with new understanding of how important the young man was. John Q perused the paper and found another murder. This time the headline read, "Nurse Murdered with Syringe." He held it up for Reece to see. "What about this one?" John Q asked. "Long user without a doubt," Reece answered, then added by way of explanation, "Loves syringes." John Q kept turning the pages. "Woman bitten and beaten to death" caught his eye. "And this one?" "Ratboy and Slayer," Reece explained. "I'm not surprised those two are working together. They'll probably kill one another eventually, though. Ratboy's not exactly stable," Reece said, tapping his forehead, "if you know what I mean." John Q frowned. "But the bite marks on the arms and legs?" "Ratboy," Reece said. "He doesn't sharpen those teeth for nothing, and he likes to bite." Reece selected another newspaper from atop the desk and found the article entitled, "Killer Leaves Kiss of Death on Victim." "This one's Magnolia. She's one tough chick. Hates men with a passion. She thinks men were responsible for the program. She was always saying her father betrayed her and sent her there. Look at the way she killed the victim, crushed his balls first, then stabbed him through the Adam's apple. And when I saw she had left a kiss on the man's cheek, I knew it was her. Reece flipped through the pages and tore out an article entitled "Man Murdered, Then Hung to Dry," then grabbed another broadsheet and found the article headed "Priest Murdered in Own Church." He held them side by side for John Q to read. "These two are strange," Reece began. "I can't pick the style. It's not caliper. I was thinking perhaps these murders were the Deacon's." John Q crossed his arms and looked at the young man beside him with a knowing smile. "I was thinking the same thing," he said. "The priest who was killed, Father Clements, was the man who originally reported the Deacon to the authorities 20 years ago. Looks to me like the Deacon went back for revenge." For the next hour, the two men discussed the other murders in the newspapers. When the old fool wasn't looking, Reece picked his pocket and stashed the prize between the pages of a newspaper. John Q never noticed. He made brief notes on a pad while Reece talked, knowing every scrap of information he gleaned was vital if the ex-program subjects were to be recaptured. When Reece had dispensed with the last murder, he moved away from the desk and faced John Q. "All right, I've answered your questions. How about now you answer some of mine?" John Q slipped the pen and notepad back into his shirt pocket. "Shoot." "So who are you?" he said. John Q considered his response. "I'm someone with a strong desire to see the program's subjects brought in off the streets." "Why?" Reece asked. "Well, that's a long story," John Q replied with a sigh. "As you can see, I'm not going anywhere," Reece pointed out. John Q smiled sadly and settled himself more comfortably onto the desk. 15 years ago, I was the chief physician in a covert agency. It works directly for the government and undertakes a lot of experimental ventures. The government wanted me to develop a biological and psychological profile on serial killers, the kind of tool that could assist law enforcement agencies in their murder investigations. At about that time, a man was convicted of a brutal series of murders in and around Melbourne. He was a church minister who preyed on the parishioners of his church. During the trial, the newspapers nicknamed him the Deacon. The government decided I should develop a profile based on a comprehensive study of the Deacon. And that's exactly what I did. I devoted 5 years of my life to it. But my work had its limitations. And in the end, it turned out that the government wanted a more powerful tool for tracking down serial killers. Rapid advances in genetic research meant that scientists could sequence the human genome quickly and accurately. "Do you know what the genome is?" Reece nodded. "DNA, our genetic code." "Right," John Q said. "The building blocks that make us who and what we are." The government realized it could use the genomic technologies to take the next step in its effort to profile the serial killer. The ultimate step, to find the gene responsible for making a person behave like a psychopath. Nobody knew if such a gene existed. In order to conduct an effective experiment like that, the doctors needed more than one subject. The Deacon wasn't enough. The study would require lots more serial killers. "So they created the program," Reece said. "Correct," John Q continued. "The objective was to find the gene of a serial killer and then extract it or reprogram it. I fought the government on the project, but people much higher than me in the bureaucracy had already given the program the green light. Imagine the benefits to society, they said. After a while, I made too much noise and was stood down as chief physician. I still had security clearance, but was no longer in charge. After that, the construction of the facility was completed, and the first batch of young subjects was acquired. You were one of the last, you know, number 202. "I know," Reece said, "and I've got an iris marker in my left eye to prove it." John Q blinked in remembrance. An image of the mechanical device which burned the code PXS-202 onto Reece's eye came into his mind. "Ah yes, I'd forgotten about that. Does it hurt?" "No," Reece said. The early subjects had their codes tattooed on their wrists, but apparently they kept cutting them out, the former chief physician mused. So the doctors developed the iris marker technology. Anyway, I no longer do any work for the government, but I have managed to retain certain privileges. Now I spend my time acting behind the scenes, you could say. Reece was contemplative for a time. Everything John Q had said accorded perfectly with what he knew of the program from his time there and from the nurse's soul memories. "See, this is the thing," Reece said. "Nobody in the program was an angel, certainly not me, And I was the best of them. Invite them round for dinner at your mother's place, and they'll end up having your mother for dinner. They were all bad people. Ratboy, Slayer, Guill O'tine, the lot of them. But what the government did to them was still wrong. Crashing the train to escape was wrong, but keeping us locked up underground was wrong too. Reece wiped his hand over his face. Jesus, you can go crazy thinking about this stuff. John Q sighed. Bad things happen to good people all the time, Reece, he said. It's the one constant, wherever you are. But sometimes, bad things happen to bad people. That's what happened in the program. Reece shook his head. I still can't believe the government was responsible. The old man nodded. He too had been surprised by such things once upon a time. It's really not so amazing. Free world governments have a terrible track record when it comes to human rights violations. The program is just one of many. Reece looked skeptical. Example? He asked. The United States, 70 years ago, John Q explained. Their government conducted something called the Tuskegee experiment. The Public Health Service wanted to find out more about syphilis, so it acquired several hundred people who had the disease and put them in a government hospital. The doctors told the patients they were being treated with the latest drugs, but in fact, the patients received no treatment. The doctors, you see, wanted to study the progression of the bacteria through the human body. Every day the patients got sicker and sicker, all the time believing they were receiving medical treatment. Many of them died. This is the kind of thing free world governments do. In the 40s, the British were burning their troops with mustard gas to determine how effective a weapon it was. Then in the 60s, they exposed more alleged volunteers to radiation and took lots of photos. The Australian government is no exception. It's just another case of the end justifies the means. Someone decided that the genetic profile of a serial killer was worth 200 lives. Reece swallowed the lump in his throat. Why didn't you try and stop it? Go to the newspapers? The old man's melancholy gaze fell to his shoes. Because people who betray government secrets have considerably shortened lifespans, so I did nothing. I merely stayed on as an observer. Reece nodded. Despite everything, he couldn't find it in himself to condemn the old bastard. The director's dead, you know, he said. Ratboy and the others got him before they incinerated the place. I guess there's something poetic about that, John Q replied. When they stood me down as chief physician, he was the man who stepped in and took over. Then he looked Reece in the eye. So, in answer to your question, who am I? I'm just an old man who wants to put things right. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. And you want my help, Reece said. Yes, John Q replied. I can't do it alone. You know more about the program's inmates than anyone else. I'm sure you know the mainframe computer was destroyed. All of the information regarding the inmates was stored there. There were no remote site backups. The engineers never foresaw the destruction of the mainframe. The government has nothing. No photos, no physical descriptions. All they have is a list of aliases and an empty super prison. Reece rubbed his forehead as if to massage away the consternation. But why me, John? He asked. Why do you trust me? Why did you choose to track me down? This was the question John Q had been waiting for Reece to ask all along. Because I know you're not like the rest of them, he said, smiling. Why do you think I come down here without my gun? I wouldn't tread within 100 meters of the other inmates without being armed to the teeth. How you survived in that environment, I can only guess. Reece remained silent, brooding. And then there were the rumors of your clairvoyance. John Q continued, watching the young man carefully. The inmates believed it. Some of the nurses believed it. Reece, I trust you because I think you've got some kind of power, a power I can't even begin to understand. Whatever it is, your power mistakenly got you put in the program. I don't think you're a murderer at all. John Q waited for Reece to reply, but the young man said nothing and just stared at the mirror on the far side of the room. The former chief physician of the SP, D, stood and moved toward the stairs. Don't worry, John Q said. Your secret is safe with me. But think about what I've said. I need your help and you need mine. The feds are out there, everywhere. I can protect you. New name, identification, money, the works. Help me catch the ex-program inmates, and I'll do everything in my power to keep you free. John Q ran his hand through his thinning hair and stared hard at Reece Nylander. That's why I've kept you down here. I want to make a deal. Then he walked up the steps and was gone. 2 hours later, he returned. Reece was sitting on the ground. Nay, Sarand, leaning up against the bookshelf, waiting for him. "All right, jackass," John Q growled as he thumped down the stairs. "Give it back." "Give what back?" Reece asked innocently. The old man stopped on the bottom step, a dark expression on his face. "My," he began to say, then saw it on the desk. He walked over and retrieved his federal police badge, which Reece had lifted from his pocket the last time he'd paid the basement a visit. "I thought you said you were with a covert government agency, John," Reece said quietly. "Not the federal police." John Q pocketed the item. The name of the agency was Special Projects Division. They were responsible for the program. It's a division of the federal police. Reece picked at his fingernails. "You used to work for them?" "Yes," John Q replied. "But not anymore?" Reece pressed. "Right," John Q said. Reece was quiet for a moment and then said, "But you still keep the badge." "I told you," John Q said carefully. "I've managed to retain some privileges." Reece looked at the old man with blue eyes so cold that John Q shivered. "I want to get one thing straight, John. This is not negotiable. The program has been destroyed, right?" "Yes," the old man said. "If I help you catch them, they go into the regular prison system," Reece stated. "Not to be studied, not to be profiled, only to be kept away from the community. They're killers, but I won't help you send them back to the program." The former chief physician nodded. "I just want them off the streets." "Promise me, John," Reece said with a hard voice. John Q nodded. "I promise," he said. Reece stood up and stretched, seeming to have resolved some inner turmoil which he'd been battling. The pair were silent for a while, each contemplating the changes to come. "Where will I live?" Reece asked finally. "I thought you could go to university, get an education," John Q replied. "Most of the universities have accommodation on campus. You'll fit right in, I think." "What about identification?" Reece asked. "I'll have it all arranged in 48 hours, the old man explained. Reece spent the remainder of his time staring out the little window above his bed. The small rectangle permitted only a limited view of the blue sky world, but those slivers of sunlight on his face were more than he'd had in the program. At lunchtime the following day, John Q instructed the young man to sit on the chair while he removed the bandage and inspected the shoulder injury. Reece's gaze never left the window and the freedom beyond. "You want to know, don't you?" he asked. "I am curious, yes," John Q admitted. The young man paused, collecting his thoughts. A long time ago, he vowed never to tell anyone. How the wily inmates of the program had discovered his clairvoyant secret, he could only guess. The soul is real, you know. It's not just the figment of an overactive imagination. When a person dies, their soul leaves the body and floats away. I've seen it happen. I always see it happen. The souls float away and leave behind a trail of tiny stars that are a person's memories and skills. Everything they've learned and seen and heard and felt and thought and dreamed in their lifetime, condensed into a metaphysical point in space. I call them soul memories. They're a bit like DNA, you know, how one tiny but complete piece of DNA contains all of a person's genetic information. Well, a soul memory contains all of a person's experiential information. That's how I learned to write at such a young age. My first soul memory was from a 40-year-old guy who died in a car accident. At the age of 3, I got all his skills and memories. Pretty weird, really. John Q had forgotten more about medicine than most doctors ever knew, and he'd never seen any conclusive evidence that clairvoyance existed in this world. He was a scientist by profession, skeptical by nature. Religious dogma had never held any sway with him. He'd read the books about telekinesis and ESP and the like. The problem was that half of the nutters who claimed to have these powers also maintained they had been prodded and probed by little green men in flying saucers. As for souls and soul memories, they were the stuff of pure fantasy. But he was certain all the way down to his scientific core that every word Reece Nylander said described the true nature of things. "Do you see where the souls go?" John Q asked. "You mean, do I see heaven or hell?" Reece asked. "Yes," the old man said. "I see something," Reece mused, "like a black hole. Some of the souls get sucked into it. I don't know what's on the other side. Why, have you been a good Christian? John Q shook his head. I'm not a spiritual person. The souls know what's on the other side, Reece mused, but the soul memories never show it. I'm just wondering, John Q said, if you get a person's skills, why aren't you a killer too? Why don't you collect soul memories? Accumulating other people's skills could make you powerful. Reece took his eyes off the view out the window and half turned toward the old man. Because I see how they die, John, he said sternly. And trust me, dying is not a pleasant experience. No soul memory is worth the knowledge it brings. Oh, John Q said, then changed the topic. Your shoulder is healed up nicely. Great, Reece said flatly. Reece rose early the following morning and packed all his belongings into the luggage John Q had supplied him with. Then he shaved and studied his face in the mirror. He'd put on weight in the last 2 weeks, and his hair had begun to grow out, straight and black. As he examined his reflection, he saw little of the inmate who clambered out of that fiery hole in the ground 2 weeks earlier. His shoulder wound had almost healed up, but a scar would remain, one of many on his body. Other than the iris marker in his left eye, the scars were the only physical evidence that he had ever been part of the program. All that remained was for John Q to provide him with false identification, and the ruse would be complete. Later that morning, the old man did exactly that. Smith, Reece said dubiously. In his hands was a new driver's license, complete with photograph. My name is Reece Smith. Is that the best you could come up with? John Q chuckled. Do you have any idea how common the name Smith is in this country? You'll blend right in. Marvelous, Reece muttered. The old coot selected another card and handed it to Reece. This one is your ATM card. I'm putting $1,000 per week into the account. That should be more than enough. A small, burgundy-coloured booklet was proffered next. This is your passport, John Q said, just in case you need the extra identification if the authorities ever start asking questions. But don't use it to leave the country. If you leave the country, I stop paying the money into your account. If you stop helping me, I stop paying the money into your account. If you do anything contrary to our deal, I stop paying the money into your account. Got him. Yep, Reece said. There's something else you should know, John Q said, still holding the passport. He waved the booklet at the young man, emphasizing his point. This false identity will hold up under scrutiny, but if the authorities want to unravel it, they can. No false identity is perfect, and yours is no exception. So avoid the police. Be good. Don't get arrested. For God's sake, don't steal anything. I've provided you with more than enough money to live on. Don't get into drugs. If you have to drink, don't get arrested for being too drunk. Basically, don't screw up. Got that? Don't worry, I've got it, Reece grunted. He accepted the passport and turned around to stow it safely in his packed luggage. While the young man's attention was diverted, John Q smoothly drew his tranquilizer gun from inside his leather jacket and pointed it at Reece with a wry smile. And there's one more thing, the old bastard said. Reece turned around and saw the gun. Ah, you've got to be joking. John Q shrugged. Sorry, kid, I can't let you see where my little safe house is. He squeezed the trigger.
That is the end of this chapter. To listen to the next chapter on YouTube or to purchase the digital ebook from Amazon, see the links in the description.